More variety.
We ain't one at a time in here. We're mass communicating.
You're listening to Para X.
You know, there's nothing like a great memory of a great time. And if you grew up during the 1950s, 60s, 70s, or 80s, boy, have we got the memories for you. There was no time more innocent than the 1950s or 60s, nor was there a time more politically explosive. Hi, this is Steve Shockley, a.k.a. The Shock. Join me live every Friday and Saturday night from 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern for a Baby Boomer Rock with a Shock sock hop on rockwithashockradio.com. Welcome to Stirring the Cauldron. Now, here's your host, Marla Brooks.
Hey, merry meet everybody, and welcome to Stirring the Cauldron here on the ParaX Radio Network. Tonight's openings, its title is Eternal Mystery. And we're going to be talking about the lost colonies of ancient America with my guest, author Frank Joseph. And the mystery about who was here first has, in some cases, been extremely eternal. Frank was the editor-in-chief of Ancient American magazine from its inception in 1993 till his retirement in 2007. He's published 8 books on the lost civilization of Atlantis, more than any other writer in history, and was nominated by Japan's Savant Society as Professor of World Archaeology. Now, if you think that Columbus discovered America in 1492, you might want to think again. Frank's book, The Lost Colonies of Ancient America, is a comprehensive guide to the pre-Columbian visitors that really discovered our country. And while it may remain an eternal mystery to some, Frank has pretty much spelled out the who's, the what's, the where's, the when's, and even the why's. So, Frank, welcome to Stirring the Cauldron.
Well, thank you very much. I hope we can stir some controversy up tonight.
Yeah. Well, I read the book, and it just left, like 1,000 questions in my head, and hopefully you'll be able to point me in the right direction on some of them. But before we get deeper into finding out more about who came to America first and why, I guess one of the most obvious questions that jumped out at me was, if so many people were here way before Columbus, why do you think they didn't stake a claim or at least make it common knowledge?
Well, they did stake many claims, but we have to understand that after the fall of the ancient world, the collapse of Roman civilization, it was followed by 500 years of dark ages. Now, when a civilization falls, it's not a pretty sight, and all of the achievements, or most of the achievements of that civilization are lost, are gone, are wiped out. And the dark ages that ensued after the fall of Rome made no exception to all of the great discoverers and world travelers that were known in ancient Rome, the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Sumerians, so many people that traveled around the world and visited America for hundreds and thousands of years. And that was all lost except for a few scraps of legends and myths. And it was from those scraps that Christopher Columbus was able to put together his voyage to the New World in 1492. Just because there were other discoverers of America long before him doesn't take away or tarnish his greatness in the least. That's an achievement that he had, is he established permanent contact between the ancient world, and the old world and the new world. And the others hadn't done that. All that achievement that they had was lost. And he was at the beginning of the Renaissance, or the Renaissance was actually going for a while, but still the relatively early centuries of the Renaissance, which meant a revival, as it were, of all the old lost traditions, and our civilization had to sort of start all over again. And that explains why so much of the previous achievements by the Romans and other peoples was lost.
Well, that makes sense. Now, as you said a minute ago, according to your research, the Sumerians, the Romans, the Africans, Chinese, Japanese, Phoenicians, Vikings, and even Knights Templar, and that's just tip of the iceberg, landed on our shores centuries before, in some cases, Columbus. Is there an accurate way of pinpointing who the very first were to colonize America?
No, because the first visitors to North America and the Americas preceded even the earliest known people we know by many thousands of years. An example of that is something that's known as the Clovis Points. These are found in the American Southwest, and they are associated with some of the very earliest inhabitants of the Americas. They go back about 13,000 or more years ago. Mainstream science tells us that there were no human beings in North America before, 12,000 or at most 15,000 years ago. And yet these Clovis points that are found, they're like spearheads, are not found in Siberia, which is where supposedly the very first Americans came from. They crossed over supposedly a land bridge that linked Siberia with Alaska, the Bering Straits. And they funneled over this land bridge and inhabited America. And yet these Clovis points resemble nothing that is found in Siberia, but they're dead ringers for the same type of points that are found in western France and associated with a people known as the Solutreans. The Solutreans were an Ice Age people who lived about 18,000 years ago. And it is their points that are mirror images of the same artifacts that are found there. So who were the very first visitors to America? We don't know. It goes back even much further than that. What I try to do with my book is I try to take those people who were very well documented, people who we absolutely did know, the names of the people that came here, why they came here, when, what did they achieve, what happened to them. So I started with them. These are the very first known civilizers. And a civilization is usually associated with building a city where you have organized labor, you have stratified government, organized religion, institutionalized religion, culture, arts, the sciences, all those sort of things combined in one. And the very earliest known one was in Mesopotamia. These people were called the Sumerians. And the Sumerians flourished about 5,500 years ago. They began about 5,500 years ago and lasted to right about 4,000 years ago. So they had a long pedigree. And it is these people, the very earliest known civilizers who live in an area we now know as Iraq, Mesopotamia, between the two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, that these earliest civilizers were here in the Americas and created a very great city themselves, which is called Caral. It's on the west coast of Peru. We can talk about that, and we can also talk about the cylinder seals that were left behind. These are engraved seals, usually for business receipts, and there were dozens, maybe hundreds of these, tens of hundreds of these things may have existed between the Mississippi River and New England in North America. So the Sumerian impact on the Americas is very strong. We know why they came here. They came here primarily for cotton. The Sumerians were great lovers of cotton, but the environment in Iran and Iraq did not facilitate production of cotton. They had to pay high prices for it, for getting cotton from India. Mm-hmm. They found out that they could grow their own cotton by coming over to the Americas, and that's exactly what they did. At this place called Caral that I mentioned, we do know, the archaeologists tell us, that cotton production was very important, actually the primary economic factor in the rise of Caral, which also was contemporary with the Sumerian city of Ur, U-R. And we find the great ziggurat of Ur, which is a kind of a pyramid, sort of a step pyramid, a characteristic pyramid built by the Sumerians. We find the same basic structure found at Caral, at the Pyramid Mayor. So these comparisons are just remarkable, and they're just the very tip of the iceberg, as it were.
Right. Now, I want to talk about some of the evidence that left behind in a second, but I've got a question from the chat room and a question for myself that just popped into my head as you were talking. So many of these peoples came and colonized here, but none of them stayed. They didn't lap over one into the other over the ages. It was like they came temporarily. I mean, temporary could be, 5-10 years, but they just kind of came and then went back when they were done with what they intended to do, or how do you explain that?
No, that's a misconception, actually. The Sumerians that landed in Peru and the western coastal Peru, they stayed for many centuries. They were here a very long time. And they did overlap other visitors from the ancient Old World who also appeared at about the same time. The Sumerians were the earliest, but they were followed very quickly by the ancient Egyptians. The Egyptians also came to South America, and they came for completely different reasons. They were not interested in cotton production. They were interested in cocaine. They came for a drug, a narcotic, which has never grown in North Africa, does not grow in the Nile Valley, and cocaine only flourishes in northern Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. And the Egyptians came here for that because they needed cocaine, not for a recreational drug. They used it for altered states of consciousness in their religious rituals, but more important than that, or more utilitarian than that, they used cocaine as an anesthesia in their medical practices. The ancient Egyptians were highly skilled medical practitioners, and as a matter of fact, they were only eclipsed really into the 20th century. They were very successful brain surgeons, eye surgeons. They had a pregnancy test, an accurate pregnancy test that wasn't rediscovered until the 1920s.
Wow.
And the reason why we know for an indisputable fact that the Egyptians came here for cocaine was because in the early 1990s, about 1991-92, when a survey was being conducted of the mummies at the very famous museum, the Cairo National Museum in Egypt, they're using new investigative techniques, and it was discovered that trace elements of cocaine were found in not dozens, but literally hundreds of Egyptian mummies that went back to the earliest dynasties, all the way on up to almost Ptolemaic times. But what was interesting is that those mummies that experienced or rather the mummies with the greatest number of cocaine trace elements paralleled those pharaohs that were known to have launched major trading expeditions. I'm referring especially to the greatest queen of ancient Egypt. Her name was Hatshepsut. In the year 1500 BC, she launched a major overseas trading expedition that took 3 years. And when they returned to Egypt successfully, they brought back a number of trade goods from all over Africa and India and even the Americas, and that included cocaine. And that trace elements are left, as I say, in mummies associated especially with her reign, although not exclusively. Mm-hmm. So what's interesting, when I was writing this book, The Lost Colonies of Ancient America, I had a really transforming experience. I'd been studying the impact made by overseas visitors to the Americas for many years, for decades. But this book was different because each chapter of the book deals with a specific people that came here. And what I wanted to do was not just to put all the evidence that I knew, but to put in the very best evidence, the most convincing, credible evidence for these people. And as I wrote this book, it was as though for the first time a great panorama, a historical panorama opened up before my mind's eye, and I got to see, as it were, this enormous drama that began really in earnest with the Sumerians and continued all the way on up through the ancient world into the medieval period and all the way up until the Christian era just before Columbus. And it's a tremendous story. I mean, it's our story as Americans. And to think that I was raised on the idea that before 1492 there was no real American history. What's referred to as American prehistory was nothing of real particular significance, just mostly Indian tribes, and that American history really doesn't begin until Columbus. Well, I found out that's to be totally untrue, as completely untrue as anything can be, that civilizations rose and fell here for hundreds and thousands of years, and sometimes these civilizations were at loggerheads with each other. They were in competition. They fought. Other times they cooperated. Sometimes they got along with the local people quite well, and other times they did not. And it's a tremendous legacy, which I feel really needs to be told and appreciated, regardless of consensus reality and the textbook versions of the past, which are completely invalidated by the evidence that's been piling up over the past few years.
Mm-hmm. All right, let me get to a couple of chat room questions because I still have a whole lot that I want to talk about. Mark in the chat room says this may be out of your area, but he would be interested in your reaction to the disc-like anomaly found at the bottom of the Baltic Sea. Do you know about that?
That is something which is still being investigated. For those of our listeners not familiar with that, about, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not an expert in this, but I believe about 5 or 7 years ago, what appears to be a very anomalous-looking structure or shape found at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, resembling some kind of a circular or spherical object. And people have suggested that it's very, very old, and they're not able to identify what it is. It's an unidentified, non-moving object at this point. But I think that I think far more research has to be done on that. I hesitate to say this because I'm trying to be a true scientist, and a true scientist is anyone, regardless of whether they're educated or not. A scientist is just someone who is using the scientific method to determine the truth. And a true scientist is someone who does not exclude the evidence. What he does is he sifts through it, and he tries to use discernment and use those pieces of evidence that are valuable at the time, but he doesn't discard any evidence, none. That's a mistake. If you throw a piece of evidence away, I've done this myself. If I lost something or thrown it away, I will regret that because things I'll learn later on confirm that that piece of evidence was worthwhile. So even someone who's highly trained and has a lot of degrees behind their names, the moment that they say, oh no, this is impossible, then they've abrogated their true status as a scientist, and they're just avocational for their particular theories. I have no theories. When I begin writing books like this, I know very little about what I'm writing about. I'm interested in a particular subject, and I accumulate as much data and information as I can, and then let the theory, if possible, or conclusions emerge from the facts, not the other way around. I don't have a theory or a conclusion to begin with and try to jam facts together and try to force a theory down somebody's throat or try to make a theory work. I don't work that way. I work the exact opposite way. I accumulate the information and then let the conclusion arise from the facts, or at least let the reader make their own deductions.
Well, that's very smart. Now we have another question. You were talking about Clovis a while back, and the question is, have archaeologists found any burial mounds or artifacts from the Clovis sites?
The Clovis sites were of a people who did not have burial mounds. What they left behind are tools and like weapon artifacts, arrowheads and spearheads and things like that. So no, nothing like that has been found. But what is interesting is that the mounds that have been excavated have sometimes revealed a very politically incorrect evidence. And I'm thinking especially about a so-called Indian mound that was excavated at the end of the 19th century by an archaeologist working with the Smithsonian Institution, a university-trained archaeologist with a very prestigious organization. And in this one mound in eastern Tennessee was found an unusual skeleton. He was it belonged to a man, a little bit taller than the average Native Americans, and under his skull was found a slate tablet with an inscription on it. Well, we know that Native Americans did not have a written language, that they didn't work in stone in this way, and so this inscription was condemned as just an intrusive burial. In other words, the mound itself was dated to about 2,000 years old, but the object was supposedly somebody stuck it inside at a later time. And it was only much later, decades later, after a photograph that the Smithsonian published of this eastern Tennessee tablet, that a woman who worked with the United States Navy as a cryptographer, in other words, she helped break the access codes during World War II, felt that there was something more authentic about this particular inscription, and she showed the photograph to Dr. Cyrus Gordon at Brandeis College. He was, at that time, in the 1960s, the world's leading authority on ancient languages from the Near East. He immediately identified this tablet as Paleo-Hebrew, as written and spoken a little after the time of Christ. In other words, about 125 A.D. And the inscription read simply, "For Judea." Well, when Dr. Gordon made this statement, he was viciously attacked by his colleagues. The entire archaeological establishment rose up and referred to him as a rogue scholar, and a very shameful set of circumstances. But in the year 2007, not too long ago, Scott Walter, who is a university-trained geologist, he owns and runs his own geological laboratory in St. Paul, Minnesota. It's an award-winning geological laboratory. He submitted the stone, called the Bat Creek Stone, to electron microscopes and state-of-the-art equipment, and was able to determine that the inscription, because of its mineralization, could only have been made at the time that this so-called Indian mound was made. In other words, about 125 A.D. And that conforms perfectly with Dr. Cyrus Gordon's linguistic evidence, because he said that that inscription was made about 125 A.D. So here we have a piece of hard evidence. This is physical proof. There is no more debate about it. This Bat Creek stone was inscribed by someone who understood Paleo-Hebrew about 125 A.D. at the time that this mound was made, and it is beyond question now. It is indisputable physical proof. And yet, despite this great discovery, there's been no change in the textbooks whatsoever, and there has been not even any discussion that I've seen in the mainstream press or on television. What's particularly interesting is that in eastern Tennessee, this is by no means the only connection with the ancient Old World. Mm-hmm. The people that live in eastern Tennessee are a very famous Indian tribe called the Cherokee. When a DNA study was done on the Cherokee about the same time, about 2007 to 2010, the DNA study showed that a significant section of the modern-day Cherokee population traces its ancestry back to the hills of Gehenna in Israel. And this is not through any modern-day contacts. The DNA study shows that this genetic lineage goes back to the hills of Gehenna about 2,000 years ago. Again, similar to the Bat Creek stone. Mm-hmm. That still isn't the end. In eastern Tennessee, in the early 1930s, an entire Egyptian temple was unearthed by the Tennessee Valley Authority. And when photographs, which appeared in a leading article with the New York Times, were shown to Rendell Harris in England. Rendell Harris was the leading scholar of ancient history in England, one of the leading ancient scholars of ancient history in the world at that time. He identified, just from the photograph, obvious cultural traits that identified this structure that was found in eastern Tennessee as belonging to a temple that was created to the Egyptian goddess Isis. Now, what's remarkable about that, and it still doesn't stop, because the name Tennessee itself, the name Tennessee translates perfectly into the ancient Egyptian language as Tanessa, which means the land of Isis. Tana is land, and Essa is the way that they pronounce the name Isis. Isis is actually the Greek version of the Egyptian Essa. So here you have a huge amount of evidence, hard physical evidence, by some very prestigious scholars establishing important contacts in eastern Tennessee with the ancient Old World. And these contacts have been known now since the 1930s. They've been absolutely confirmed by geological testing in the 21st century. And we hear nothing about it. I mean, this should be big news that the ancient Hebrews and the ancient Egyptians were setting up shop in eastern Tennessee thousands of years ago.
Well, I also read in the book about the pre-Columbian archaeological site in Ohio, and it also had something to do with Egypt's Great Pyramid, did it not?
Well, that's remarkable. There is a outstanding earthwork, probably the outstanding ancient earthwork on Earth. This is in Newark, Ohio. And the Newark mounds, as they're referred to, are these enormous embankments. One is a perfectly executed circle. It's absolutely gigantic, and it is connected by two smaller ramparts to an octagon-shaped mound. They're so gigantic they cannot be appreciated from the ground. You can only appreciate them in all their perfect proportions from an aerial perspective. Mm-hmm. And what's remarkable about that octagon mound is that the octagon mound in Ohio, in Newark, Ohio, has all of the geometric conformity, perfect geometrical conformity with the ground plan of the Great Pyramid of Egypt. And this was established by Professor James P. Shears at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And when he presented his evidence, it was understood, and he was recognized, this is back in the 1970s when he first publicly discussed this. He was at that time the Midwest's leading archaeoastronomer. In other words, he was able to establish the relationship between these ancient mounds and their alignments or orientations to various celestial phenomena. So he really knew what he was talking about. This was his specialty. And after actually a couple of decades of work on this, he was able to show the mathematical relationship between the Newark mounds and the Great Pyramid of ancient Egypt. So the impact of the ancient Egyptians on both North America and South America was profound, long-lasting, and beyond question.
Wow, that is amazing. I've got a follow-up question from the chat room from Kat. You were talking about the slate tablet that was found in the skull that translated to be for Judea. She's wondering, was it for Judea as in claiming the land, do you think?
We really don't know because it would appear that that tablet was broken off of a larger inscription. Mm-hmm. And that's all of the inscription that remains. Now, what's interesting about the year 125 A.D. is that coincides with the destruction of Jerusalem by the Roman Emperor Titus. And it's possible that this particular Indian mound and the inscription found inside it related to someone who, or a group of people who survived the destruction of their city. We do know that there was a great Roman Jewish historian by the name of Josephus. And Josephus, in his very detailed description of the destruction of Jerusalem by Emperor Titus, says that a number of the survivors escaped the Romans and sailed across the sea to a totally unknown land. That's remarkable. I mean, you can read that in your standard text. You can go to any library and get Josephus' works that will talk about the fall of Jerusalem and mention that. But that's one of the facts that modern scholars prefer to ignore, unfortunately. But I think that the text, in other words, to answer the question as succinctly as I can, that text for Judea would appear to be linked with, I presume, a veteran of the war against Rome who, after their defeat, escaped to America. And it's like being interred with your Purple Heart or something like that. I think it was identifying a soldier who had fought against Rome and found refuge in North America. And that really points up so many of the different reasons why people came here. I mentioned that the Sumerians came for cotton, and the Egyptians came for cocaine. And other people, like the Hebrews, after defeat or oppression someplace, came to America as refuge. America, apparently, because of its geographical position, has always been a place of refuge, not only just in recent times, but in ancient times as well.
Mm-hmm. It's true. Well, another piece of evidence that kind of jumped out at me was a metal plate with the image of a Phoenician woman that was found in the Utah desert. Now, we've got Utah, we've got Tennessee, we've got Ohio. Oh, my goodness. I mean, they're all over the place. But tell us about the metal plate with the Phoenician woman's image.
It's very beautiful. Unfortunately, we don't know much of the circumstances of its discovery. It is not a fake. That's been established, I think, beyond question. I go into some detail on that in the book. Unfortunately, we do know that it was found only by a family sometime, apparently in the 1930s. It was found in Utah. We have a general idea where. It's a beautiful octagon-shaped bronze plate, and it represents the profile of a woman, and at first glance it looks very Egyptian. But what's remarkable about this plate, besides its very high craftsmanship, is that this woman is portrayed wearing a very unusual headdress. And the headdress kind of resembles like two plates on either side of her head, obscuring part of her profile. And it's very unique. And yet it's found identically a sculpture that was found in Seville, Spain. She's known as the Lady of Elche. Elche is a suburb of Seville. And shortly after the turn of the 20th century, this beautiful sculpted head was found. And this woman, called the Lady of Elche, is wearing an identical headdress, absolutely identical to that of the woman portrayed on the Utah plate. The Lady of Elche is a portrait of either a royalty or an aristocratic woman from the Punic or Phoenician occupation of Spain. This is during the time before Rome. This would be about 300 or 200 BC. And what's remarkable is that the Phoenicians who inhabited Spain and Portugal at this time were known as very great seafarers, and that they obtained a great deal of their economic wealth from a place they called Antillia. And Antillia was just some area far across the Atlantic Ocean. And the Phoenicians would spread all kinds of rumors about how if you travel too far out at sea, you would fall off the edge of the world. And that's how that got started. Or if you went too much further, there were great sea monsters and serpents, or the seas would begin to boil your ship. And this was propaganda that was put out by the Phoenicians in order to discourage competition. And the Romans, of course, were their great competitors. And by putting out this type of kind of really industrial propaganda, it lingered all the way into Columbus's time, because, as we've heard, some of the arguments against Columbus were, you can't sail out too far because you'll fall off the edge of the world. The world is flat. And it was that sort of legacy that had been left by the Phoenicians.
Wow.
The Phoenician impact on North America is also great, and I have a long chapter on their wonderful influences at work here.
Now, speaking of the Phoenicians, this is kind of interesting, and it makes a little bit of sense, but I'm sure you can explain it. I was talking to someone the other day about your book, and when I mentioned the Phoenicians, he was adamant about the fact that the Phoenicians had absolutely no way of getting here. He could understand the Vikings, but was very, kind of dubious about the Egyptians as well. So how did these races that were not known for their adventures on the high seas manage to cross continents to come to our shores?
Well, actually, the Phoenicians were very well known for crossing the seas. As a matter of fact, that's what they built their enormous wealth upon. The Phoenicians were a people who originated in the Near East. They were a small, shut-it-away people until the fall of the Bronze Age. And while chaos was overwhelming places like Egypt and Troy, the Phoenicians picked up the pieces, as it were, and became very great and spread out all across the Mediterranean, beyond the Mediterranean, into the Atlantic. We know about their colonies in Morocco, like Mogador and Lixus, and we know about their colonies like Cartagena and in Spain and Portugal. And they built their entire incredibly wealthy economy on their mercantile fleets. So there's no dispute that these people were very proficient mariners. We know, for example, and this is now mainstream history that I'm giving you. This is not the alternative view. This is mainstream history. We know that under an Egyptian pharaoh, whose name was Nekhau II, in 600 BC, that he commissioned a fleet of Phoenician ships because the Egyptians by that time were in decline. Their civilization was no longer what it used to be, and so Pharaoh Necho commissioned a fleet of Phoenician ships to circumnavigate the continent of Africa. And this was done long before Vasco da Gama's time. It's described by the Greek father of history, Herodotus. And so that achievement alone is remarkable. But beyond that, the hard physical evidence for Phoenicians in the Americas naturally predisposes their great maritime prowess. A Phoenician altar called a Tophet has been found outside of Los Angeles, California, as recently as the early part of this century. It's been positively identified. Another Phoenician Tophet was found much earlier on the Chicago River at a place by the Dearborn Bridge, the Wacker Bridge, by the Wacker Bridge in Chicago. And that Tophet is sculpted with the full face of an Egyptian god. And Tophet was a kind of a sacrificial altar, a rather grisly affair. The Phoenicians, for all their greatness, had probably among the worst, most repulsive religions ever concocted, in which they engaged in infanticide, in ritual murder of children, babies, their own children. And one of these Tophets, an identifiable Tophet, was found on the Chicago River in the late 19th century. It was called the Wabansi Stone. The Wabansi Stone is now in the Chicago Historical Society Museum in the basement, unfortunately. It was on public display for a long time, and I have a photograph of it in the book. And so the Phoenician impact on the Americas, I think, is profound. And I would answer this gentleman who said the Phoenicians had no way to get here. Well, what's known about the Phoenician ships shows they were highly seaworthy. There's a very brilliant scholar. His name is Lionel Casson, and he's regarded universally as the world's leading expert on ancient seamanship. And he describes the Phoenician ships in great detail, and that they were more than competent to cross the North Atlantic. Actually, the Mediterranean Sea is a far more difficult body of water to navigate because the waves are choppier. You have storms that come up that are more violent and quicker. If you can make a crossing, say from the mid-Atlantic from Morocco, and you take the Canary Island current, it will take you very easily into the Gulf of Mexico. Matter of fact, the early Spanish sailors referred to that area of the Atlantic as the Sea of Ladies, because it was such a pleasurable cruise. You could just shoot across following the Canary Island current. The Vikings, of course, didn't care about that. They went across the North Atlantic, which is rough. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
That didn't stop them at all.
No, not at all. Got a comment from the chat room, someone that came in a little bit late and wondered if you had talked about having a runestone yet. And I said, no, not yet, but we can, right?
Yes, the Having a Runestone is a remarkable discovery. It's made in 1898 by a Swedish immigrant farmer who was clearing his land in an area of central Minnesota, that this land had not been occupied by Native Americans, so far as is understood. No Native people had been displaced from this area. So he had bought this pretty well pristine land in 1898. He was clearing it with his sons and preparing it for farming when there was a large tree, an old dead tree, and he pulled it up, got the stump, and in the roots of the stump of this tree was a large boulder, a gray boulder about 3 feet long, and inscribed on two sides with writing of some kind. And when the stone was removed, this boulder was removed from the roots of this tree, it was discovered that this was a text composed in runes, R-U-N-E-S. It was a runic text. Runes, the specific written language used by the Vikings and by Scandinavian peoples long after the Viking Age. The Viking Age began about 800 A.D. and lasted to about 1200 A.D., but the Viking or Norse culture persisted, of course, for many centuries afterwards. Runes were banned by the Catholic Church eventually. They had to be used in a covert manner. But until that time, the runes were still used. And this stone was easily translated. It was translated out of medieval Swedish, and it has literally the date inscribed on it, 1361. Well, that's long before Christopher Columbus in 1492, and certainly in Minnesota, for goodness sakes. No modern Europeans reached Minnesota until the later part of the 18th century that we know. And yet this stone, which tells a story about an expedition of people from the southern area of Sweden who arrived in what is now Minnesota in 1361. They had a confrontation with Native Americans, 10 of their number, 10 of the Swedes were killed, and that the stone was left as a land claim. Well, this stone was regarded as the center point of the controversy that raged throughout the 20th century, from the end of the 19th century throughout the 20th century. Mainstream scholars, for the most part, not universally, but most mainstream scholars condemned it as a hoax, whereas alternative investigators and a few professional archaeologists and geologists felt that it was a legitimate artifact. And the matter was not finally determined until the early part of the 20th century by this very same gentleman that I mentioned earlier, Scott Walter. Matter of fact, this was Scott Walter's introduction to this sort of a thing. He had not been interested in archaeology before being presented with the Kensington runestone. A number of its supporters went specifically to Scott Walter because of his geological laboratory. And they wanted to determine if this stone, the inscription, had in fact been carved in the 14th century, or was it a modern fake? Could it be determined with geological methods? And again, Scott Walter was able to use his laboratory to prove that in fact the stone could only have been carved in the 14th century, around the middle of the 14th century. And in the process, Scott Walter made two remarkable discoveries that were completely overlooked by archaeologists. One of them was a dotted R. In other words, the runic R looks very much the same as our R, almost exactly the same. But this particular runic R that's repeated on the Kensington runestone has a dot in it. Now that's it's tremendous proof of its authenticity, because that dotted R was only appeared in the mid and early 14th century in southern part of Sweden, where the text says that these Scandinavians came from. The other the other detail that Scott Walter found, even more importantly, was the hooked X, because the hooked X never appeared in runic writing, was totally unknown to runic scholars at the time that the Kensington runestone was found in 1898. It was only until the mid-20th century that the hooked X was recognized by runic scholars. So that rules out totally any possibility of the Kensington runestone having been faked, because you couldn't fake something that nobody knew about for another 50 years or so. Mm-hmm. So the Kensington runestone, again, has been established by a university-trained geologist whose conclusions went up for peer review amongst his fellow geologists, and they supported him 100%. The archaeologists will have nothing to do with his conclusions. They don't address them. They continue to denigrate the Kensington runestone as fake, but they do not recognize the hard geological evidence which establishes unquestionably that the Kensington runestone is authentic and is not a fake. Now, this isn't to say that many artifacts that are presented as authentic artifacts, objects from the ancient past, that some of them aren't fake. There are a number of fakes that are involved. But I'm not interested in those. As a matter of fact, every museum, this might come as a shock to, I guess, to our listeners, but every museum in the world has fakes that it portrays as authentic. Now, this doesn't mean that the curators there are fraudulent. It does mean that they are fooled sometimes. And this happens from time to time. Chicanery and criminality affect every aspect of civilized life, and archaeology is not immune from that.
Right.
But the Kensington runestone has been authenticated.
Yeah, crystal skulls. When you mention artifacts, crystal skulls have been faked all along too. People just, not intentionally, but they don't know that these things aren't always real.
It takes a lot of hard testing, and sometimes the testing fails. You can't really determine if the artifact is real or not. You mentioned the crystal skull. The crystal skull from the Anna Mitchell Hedges crystal skull, which is a remarkable artifact, a great work of art, has been determined to have been made with diamond-tipped tools, which, of course, could only have been invented and used at the later part of the 19th century. And yet, at the same time, the crystal skull also has bearings of ancient tool working on it as well. So we don't know what to make of that object. Some people think it's got to be a complete fake, but then others point out, well, if it is, who could have made this great masterpiece? And even how could such a masterpiece have been made? So testing doesn't always give us a definite conclusion, unfortunately. But in the case of the Kensington runestone and the case of the Back Creek stone, there is no doubt. There is no room for argument that both of those are totally authentic artifacts.
Exactly. I've got a list of stuff here that I still want to talk about. We have no time. But I want to get this in first. Where can people find out more about you and about your books?
Well, probably the best place they can go is to the magazine that I work for. It's called Ancient American, and there's a website there called www.ancientamerican.com. They got some of my other books there, and if they want to order any of these books or just they want to talk about them, they can dial a toll-free number 24 hours a day. It's 877-494-0044. And I guess they take credit cards and all that stuff. So that's where they can. That's where I think where listeners can find out more about the lost colonies of ancient America. It's for sale through Ancient American.
All right, I've got one quick question, and a 2-minute answer probably will fit about right. Do you suspect that? And I think I already know part of this answer. Do you suspect that there is still buried evidence here in the States that has not been unearthed, and that there perhaps may be one particular piece of evidence that will unequivocally remove all doubt that Columbus was not the first, and something that might even change history books?
Well, I'll answer the last part first. There already has been abundant physical evidence that completely invalidates the idea that Columbus was the first and only discoverer of the Americas. We've talked about a few of them tonight. There are many, many more. So right. Sure, there's more to be found. I'm sure there are great discoveries still laying in wait, but the argument is over. And it's just as a matter of time before the present-day archaeologists eventually are replaced in the natural course of things by promoters of the new history. And that history is not going to be taught in the future the way it has been taught up to now.
Mm-hmm. Well, keeping an open mind and accepting things not as everything carved in stone, no pun intended, may make a big difference. But I want to thank you so much for joining me tonight. It was a very thought-provoking show and informative. And we've already had in the chat room that you must come back and talk some more.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I appreciate all the intelligent and hard questions. And it's a great discussion, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
Yes, we can. So again, thank you, and I want to thank everybody for listening in, as always. And until next time, everybody, blessed be, and merry meet again. Good night.
This has been another edition of Stirring the Cauldron with Martha Brooks. Be sure to tune in next week at the same time for another great guest and more cauldron stirring. Any rebroadcast or use of this program without explicit permission is strictly prohibited. Copyright 2013. Moonlight Hall by Kevin MacLeod, Licensed through Incompetech.com.